morning, everyone, and welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. We've been talking in a larger sense about the idea of doing translation and word studies of the ancient languages of the Bible, and looking at ways in which that can be both really helpful, but sometimes can be taken a bit too far, or sometimes we're looking for things that aren't necessarily there. So it can be a temptation to look at the ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek of the Bible as some kind of secret code that needs to be deciphered, when in actual fact it's just an ancient language. And so we have the dual task of both translating the words, but also translating the ideas and the culture, because that's what you have to do in any work of translation. And you also have to translate culture, because language is very cultural. And so that's what we're doing in word studies. And in a good word study, and a good way of looking at a word or a phrase in the ancient languages will illuminate something about that culture and that history that gives us a bit of insight to what we've called the author's intended meaning, to really try and get back at what that person is actually trying to say to us, rather than hearing what we want to hear, if that makes sense. It can be far too easy with any sort of thing to infer from texts what maybe makes sense to us in our context. We do this plenty in our modern world. We send a lot of text messages to each other back and forth. And one of the things that text messages obviously don't have is tone. And I don't know if any of you have had a bit of an argument over text that you didn't understand where it came from because someone misinterpreted tone. Either you misinterpreted their tone or they misinterpreted your tone. We do that even in our own communication now. So it's obviously going to happen as we read the Bible, that we're going to read things onto the text. But in the work of translation and in word studies, what we're trying to do is try and pull away as much as we can of the extraneous sort of self of us as the reader, and try and get back at what the author is intending. We can never do that fully, but we're doing our best. So within that sort of macro idea, we boiled it down to use as an example a sort of movement within biblical scholarship that is kind of loosely called a new perspective on Paul. So it is, again, not, these scholars are not linked to each other necessarily, other than that they're all kind of following a similar train of thought. And that train of thought goes back to this very idea, that we need to really get back to the language and the history of what's going on to interpret what someone like the Apostle Paul is saying. So rather than interpreting Paul through the lens of even 3rd or 4th century burgeoning Catholic Christianity, or reading Paul through the lens of, especially what we've done as Reformed churches, reading Paul through the lens of someone like Martin Luther and the other reformers, where we're sort of putting back on Paul that same way of seeing the Pharisees and God's grace and all of those things in the way that Luther was seeing the Catholic Church. So Luther saw a very legalistic Catholic Church forcing people to earn their salvation through the purchase of indulgences and doing all sorts of other bitty things that aren't necessarily in the gospel. And what he said is, no, it's grace through faith. It's only through that we're saved. There's none of that other sort of stuff. But he started to read Paul, and he read the Pharisees almost like they were the Catholic Church character, and he read Paul almost like it was himself. And so there are some kind of ideas that come from that are maybe not so helpful. The thing I want to talk about today really plays off of what we talked about last week. And what we talked about last week is this dual idea of grace and faith. Right. So we talked about how for ancient culture, for the time for the people living around the time that Paul's writing, there is an idea of grace and faith. Those are English words we use to translate the word charis and pistis. And so in that ancient culture, there could be a patron of like a city or a town or an area or something who would lavish their grace, their charis, on this place. This town could do nothing to earn it. It's obviously the patrons to give freely. And they might give money, they might give all sorts of things. And in response to that charis, of the patron, the town would offer pistis, which is sometimes maybe even better translated as faithfulness. We have called it faith a lot, and faith is sometimes a good translation, but sometimes faithfulness is a better response as a translation, because in response to what the patron has done, faithfulness of the town, faithfulness to that patron is what's sort of expected. Now, they're not earning that grace from the patron, but they are participating in it, in a system. And so what then that alleviates us from, when we look at that grace and faith, is it takes us out of the realm in which we see faith as a merely cognitive or intellectual pursuit, whereby Jesus has done everything he's done, he's accomplished everything he's accomplished, but what it takes on our behalf is a sort of cognitive agreement with the idea that Jesus has done this, and that is faith. We have faith. We believe in these statements as truth, and that is what saves us. So by grace, through faith, becomes Jesus died for us, and then we cognitively agree, and then that saves us. Now, the problem that creates is twofold. It's one, saying, well, isn't that earning your salvation? If you're not supposed to earn your salvation, but you're still earning it by having faith. But then also, if you're trying to say, no, you don't earn it, but then what about the good works we're called to do? What about the way we're called to live our lives as set apart and as people who seek justice and good and right and all of those things? Are those not good works? And if Jesus has died to save us, surely we don't need to do any of that. Surely it's all fine. It's all taken care of. And so for Luther, there becomes a bit of a problem with his way of looking at it, where you end up having to do some mental gymnastics to sort of argue for, no, you don't have to do anything to earn salvation, but at the same time, you should be a good Christian. And you kind of have to talk out of both sides of your mouth. Whereas if you're talking about this idea of grace, like from a patron, and faithfulness in return as a sort of symbiotic system that exists, you don't have to try and explain away good works. Obviously, the grace is unmerited, it's unearned. But at the same time, our response is faithfulness, and our response is faithfulness to God in that. So that alleviates a bit of mental gymnastics for us. So that's what we talked about last week. And I know in these episodes we're doing a lot of setup, but it's going to have a payoff. So there is a specific phrase that comes up in the New Testament. One place it comes up specifically is Romans chapter 3. And it is, this is going to be slightly technical, but I'll do my best to explain it in a way that sort of makes sense. English is a language that doesn't really do much conjugation of things. A lot of words are pretty standard. We might pluralize things or change things occasionally, but mostly our words are pretty static. And what we do is we add articles and objects onto them. So if I want to talk about my faith, you might say the faith of Peter. Peter is a word that remains the same. If you want to believe in me, like believe that I'm going to run a good race in the marathon community, you might believe in me, believe in Peter. So those words are what changes, the in or the of, whereas the word Peter stays the same. If you've studied other languages, you'll realize that not every language works like that. Other languages will actually just change the ending of a word. And modern Greek still does this. And ancient Greek is one that does this. Latin obviously also does this. Hebrew does this as well. And French even does this to a certain extent as well, though slightly different than Greek. So it's pretty common in other languages for a word like my name, Peter, to not stay the same. It actually will get different endings. And so instead of having of Peter or in Peter, you'll add an ending to a P-E-T-R something. So you'll have Petros being my name in Greek. If you have of Peter, you have Petru, or in Peter, like Petris or something like that. So you would change the ending, which looks weird to us in English because we're used to words like names staying static. So that's how Greek works. So there's a specific part in Romans chapter 3, and it's chapter 3, verse 22. In most Bibles, this is the translation you get, and this translation is very based in a Reformation way of understanding grace and faith. So in Romans chapter 3, as in a lot of Romans, Paul is arguing against this idea that we have to kind of enter back into Judaism in order to be saved. And his main argument for that, in a lot of it, is just that you can't just pick and choose. You can't make Gentile converts to Christianity get circumcised or follow the food laws if they're not going to follow all of the law. If you want to have the law, you got to have all of it. And so he's saying, but everyone, even whether you're under the law or not, is all under the same curse. We all need Jesus. That's basically his argument. Romans 3:22 says, the righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile. Now, I'll back up and read verse 21 as well. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew or Gentile. So when we read that in English, what we see is fairly straightforward, and it's a straightforward kind of, again, classic Reformation Lutheran idea. Apart from the law, that being the Torah, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through a faith in Jesus Christ. So we have faith. The onus then becomes on us. We have faith in Jesus Christ. And what's that faith as we generally are taught to understand it? It's a cognitive agreement. It's an assent to an idea. We have faith in Jesus Christ. We believe that Jesus has done these things. Through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew or Gentile. So that kind of tracks a bit. But the problem we have here is in the Greek, it isn't faith in Jesus Christ. That's not the natural way to translate that. The word, the name of Jesus Christ there has what's called the genitive ending, that "u" ending that I said for like of Peter, Petru. It's like that for Jesus here. So it is the pistos, or in this case, it's more kind of verbal, the pisteos of Jesus Christ. It is an "u" ending. So it's not an "in" ending, it's an "u" ending. So the faith, does it make sense to have the faith of Jesus Christ as if it's Jesus' own cognitive belief in himself? So that doesn't make sense either. But if we go back to this grace and faith idea of a patron in a town, and it's grace and maybe favor and faithfulness, this makes a bit more sense. So then we have this righteousness is given through faithfulness of Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile. So what is this righteousness of God then? It isn't that it is given to us because we cognitively believe in Jesus Christ, but it's actually Jesus' own faithfulness. The fact that Jesus came to earth as God, was faithful to his mission, and was faithful to a covenant with God. And through all of Jesus' actions in faithfulness, we then have salvation. So this not only makes sense a bit more grammatically with the actual Greek, because what the translators have had to do in most English translations is sort of ignore that "u" ending, that "of" ending, because in their minds it didn't make sense to have the faith of Jesus Christ, because they're thinking about it as a cognitive idea. They're not thinking about it as something imbued with action, something about faithfulness. They're thinking about faith as a belief state. And so when they come upon this verse, it doesn't make sense to translate it the faith of Jesus Christ. And so they think, well, that must be kind of a mistake, or maybe you could argue that you could get an "in" out of the "u" ending. Maybe we could do that. But that doesn't really make sense. It's like, taking a leaky bucket to a river down the mountain when there's a well right next to your house. The translation, the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, just fits more naturally. And it also fits more naturally theologically when we're talking about this idea that we have a grace not merited, something that we cannot achieve ourselves. We do not get it because of our belief, because of our own cognitive agreement. We get salvation because of the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, because everything Jesus has done and accomplished in the world and in his own death and resurrection and teaching and all of that. So this translation here, and this, again, if we can sort of zoom out from where we've zoomed in here on a couple of words, and we can zoom out to see what impact this has of the way that we translate this and the way that we think about these ideas historically and linguistically have an impact to how we live our lives as Christians. It then is easier to think of Christianity rather than a set of beliefs that you agree about as a whole way of life, as a way that we live with each other, as a way that we see the world and the way that we act in the world as Christians and as a church, that we are active people fighting for justice and for good as part of our faithfulness to God and as part of the salvation that we've received from the faithfulness of Jesus Christ who died. It all fits together, I think, much more naturally than trying to come up with the system whereby Jesus died and you have to kind of agree with it. And if you don't agree with it, then you're in trouble. Because that makes everything so dependent on us, whereas so much of the New Testament is attesting to the fact that it isn't dependent on us. That so much of this has happened outside of our control, outside of our earning, outside of anything we've done to merit it, that God has loved us so much that Jesus came to die for us in his own faithfulness. So that is how, again, we can move from kind of a macro idea of looking at the history and the language of the Bible into a sort of idea where we're looking historically at how these words and phrases function and how it might have been originally understood. And then we can look at specific words and kind of say, how are our modern biases kind of filtering into how we're translating different words? And so this is, again, not every scholar will agree with this kind of way of translation. It's a lot of people have translated it as in, but there is a sort of growing movement to kind of reimagine this rather than just going along with this kind of Lutheran Reformation, viewing the law like the Catholic Church of the 1500s. I hope this has been interesting for you. I hope it's made a bit of sense as well. I know this can be a bit sort of in the woods with some of this, but I hope that I've at least made it simple enough that you can kind of track with what I'm saying and with kind of where I'm arguing here and there. For me, I find this incredibly interesting. I like it a bit like a puzzle. And I also really enjoy history, and so for me, this is really interesting and fascinating. But I think what's important is the wider implications of what we're looking at here. It's not just, again, about playing with a puzzle, but it's about understanding why this matters and why being really careful with some of these translations can have pretty big repercussions for us as Christians. So thanks for watching along. Thanks for tracking with us. And we'll see about continuing on with some of the same sort of theme next week. So thanks for coming along for the ride. Have a good night.